Hello, my name is Sarah Mohammed and I'll be talking to you for the next 10 minutes about different types of appraisals, and we'll be comparing and contrasting some of those different types of appraisals. Now, naturally, before we start talking about the different types of appraisals, it's useful to recap on what an appraisal is. Simply put, it's a review of the performance of employees. Of course, there is much more to it than that, so usually it's designed centrally by HR. Usually it's a formal process. Usually it involves a meeting between the line manager and the employee, which usually ends with the completion of forms stored by the organisation, and that's usually completed on an annual basis. You will have noted that I've used the word usually quite a lot just there, and quite simply that's because there is so much variation between what an appraisal really looks like from one organisation to another. This gives you a slight example of some of the different aspects of appraisals and the form that they may take. We could talk for hours about this, but as we have 10 minutes today, I'd like to focus in on two key aspects of the appraisal process. The what we typically do in the appraisal process and the why we do it. So, with that in mind, we'll firstly talk about the what, and there are two key types of appraisals. There are your behavioural appraisal processes and your output-based appraisal processes, which fundamentally talk about different aspects of the individual we're appraising. We'll then move on and talk about why we do the appraisal process, and again there are two key reasons why organisations tend to embed an appraisal process. The first one we'll talk about is for the development of that particular individual, and the second is for the reward of the individuals in the organisation. So we'll start by talking about the behavioural and the output-based appraisal processes. These are really about what the appraisal itself measures. So your behavioural approach tends to be measuring, as the name suggests, what the individual has been doing, how they have been acting, what they have been saying over the course of the appraisal period. So this tends to be based on things such as what the manager has seen, but it can also be based on feedback from other people, such as customers. If we use the example here of a lecturer, it could be based on feedback from the students on that particular course. Often, when using behavioural-based approaches, organisations will use a competency framework to give some structure to that particular type of appraisal process, and they may use competencies such as interpersonal skills, ability to work under pressure, so on and so forth. On the other hand, you have your output-based appraisal processes, and these are looking less at what the individual has been doing and more at the results that that individual has achieved. So they will tend to focus on either how effective the person has been or how efficient they've been, or indeed on both of those. They may be based on simply looking at the job description, the outcomes that are expected, or they may be based on specific objectives that have been set for that particular individual. And because they're based on objectives, where the manager would tend to lead the aspects measured in the behavioural approach, it's fairly common for the employee to get much more involved in specifying the output-based objectives or targets in this type of appraisal. So, for example, if we move back to our example of a lecturer, in an output-based appraisal, you may be talking about how many students have passed that particular module, how many students have achieved a merit, so on and so forth, as opposed to how were the interpersonal skills of that particular lecturer. Of course, both of these approaches tend to have some advantages to them. So if we talk here, we'll start with the behavioural approach. The behavioural approach often involves, as we said before, a competency-based approach, and because those competencies tend to be consistent across an organisation, it means that if we look at the lecturer, a lecturer would be judged on the same criteria as the director of the organisation, as the person who cleans the floors on a daily basis, because often those competencies are fairly consistent. We can compare one person fairly easily to another. Also, there's a strong argument to say that in a behavioural based appraisal, the success or otherwise of the individual is controlled by that individual. I decide how well I cope under pressure. I decide on the type of interpersonal skills that I display. Whereas when we're looking at the output-based approach, and let's say how many students have passed the exam, there are many more factors that will affect that, namely the student's personal motivation and personal circumstances. And of course, in the behavioural-based approach, it has the advantage that it can assess areas where goals cannot be set or simply weren't set because they weren't thought about. So, for example, the output-based approach will measure lots of quantifiable things, but there may be more qualitative aspects of the role. For example, a particular lecturer may have great compassion for students and therefore spend lots of time supporting them outside of lectures in a way that just can't be measured. Or a particular lecturer may bring a great passion to the classroom that really gets students excited about a subject. And again, that may not be something that can easily be measured by an output-based approach. That said, the output-based approach also offers lots of advantages. The output-based approach, you could argue, is much more objective than the behavioural approach. It tends to be based on more quantifiable things that are more tangible, and therefore it's easier to say whether somebody has or hasn't been successful. They tend to be more specific to the job because they're not the generic competencies that we're using there. And the expectations tend to be particularly clear, especially if the organisation employs a SMART framework or something similar, and therefore the appraisal process itself can often be less time consuming because it's slightly more black and white. So there we have the behavioural and the output-based approaches or methods of assessing behaviour. Of course, the other thing we need to think about is what is the purpose of the appraisal. So it could be for the development of the individual or indeed for reward purposes. Typically, a developmental style appraisal tends to be linked to strong employee morale and satisfaction, whereas the reward approach has the advantage that you can easily make decisions such as pay decisions or promotion decisions based off the back of it. Some organisations will even use it as data that contributes towards making redundancy decisions. The developmental approach tends to have a qualitative narrative, so if your focus is on developing the individual, you will talk a lot about the details of what's been going on over the course of that year, whereas if it's for linking to reward such as pay or promotion, you tend to focus more on actually can we quantify the things that have happened for the purpose of comparison. Therefore, the developmental approach tends to be a much deeper review of the individual, whereas the reward approach has the advantage of making it easy to compare one individual to another, often by linking a quantifiable number to their performance over the course of the year. The developmental approach tends to encourage upwards feedback. For example, you may be discussing, if you're looking to develop that individual, how the environment could be changed to aid that individual to perform better, even going as far as discussing what the manager could be doing differently. Whereas if the purpose of your appraisal is to think about pay decisions, you're probably going to be focusing more on the manager providing downwards feedback to the individual themselves and focusing on what the individual could be doing differently over the next year so that they could more positively affect their pay decisions. So just to look back on what we've talked about both behavioural and output-based approaches, which can be linked to development or reward. Of course, you can use either the behavioural or the output-based approach to develop or reward the individual, and in reality many organisations will try to do all four of these in an appraisal itself. In the seminar, as we move on, we will look at what this might look like in a real life situation